Welcome at this panel discussion set of presentations today on the self and the selfie, or as we could say, from the self to the selfie. My name is Ruben Jacobs. I will be your moderator today and also will give you a small presentation. As you can see already on the screen what my background is. The first moment I was actually interested in, you could put on the presentation, on the question on the self, started somewhere, I guess, during my studies at the University of Amsterdam, sociology. And one of the first things I learned during my studies was that, yeah, the self is quite a problematic concept, in a sense, if you look at it from a sociological perspective. And one of the first things I learned that was basically the whole content of my study was that people are social creatures in many ways, and that is a very interesting time we have entered, that as we could say, or might say, narcissistic area in which we all tend to live together on an individualized way, or as some would call it like that. So the question is, of course, are we here in a room full of self-absorbed narcissists? I don't know. We'll see. Maybe that brought you here, that you are wondering if you are a narcissist or why others are narcissists. I guess these are questions we all tend to ask ourselves now and then. At the back, we have here a picture, a very famous picture of Caspar Friedrich from the Romantic period. The picture is called Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog, and I guess many would say this is a very iconic picture and is summarizes the whole set of feelings and ideas which are attached to this Romantic period from the mid-18th, 19th century. If I would give a short, literal description of the picture, you would say something like, in the foreground, a young man stands upon a rock with his back to the viewer. He is wrapped up in a dark green overcoat and grips a walking stick in his right hand. His hair caught in a wind, wandering gazes out on the landscape covered in thick sea of fog. But the question is, of course, what do we really see? Is it an expression of the mind of the painter, and a way of transporting, or a way of transcending his set of feelings to the landscape and the person which is in the middle of it. We know about Caspar Friedrich then when painting this picture, he was also in the midst of a depression, so there might be a relation to the very mystique and dark way in which the picture is being made. Others say that it is a mastery of the landscape, a mastery of the nature, in which man is in the middle of the center of existence and is a starting point of the individual age where we live in today. On the other hand, you could also say, because we don't see the face of the figure in the picture, is that we don't really know how he looks at the landscape. He might be frightened as well, or he might have the feeling that he thinks he's a very small person. It could also be a way of showing the idea of self-reflection or introspection, as gazing into the murkness of the sea of fog. It could also be a metaphor for the unknown future. But I think in most of the case it is a very iconic picture, and it says a lot about our contemporary culture and the way it has been transforming. If we go a bit further, and if you just go on the internet and you type in Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog, you see that there are also many appropriations or different versions of the same picture. Here you could already see that the city is coming into the picture, that the idea about that the nature itself is in the opposite of the urban environment is that we might live in an age in which there is no real nature anymore. There's no real authentic, original nature. Most of us live in urban cities, live in urban areas. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he protested against the modern social life and all its calculations, exploitations, its oppressions, showed modern humans the way into their interior, in their inner feelings. In his famous book, Emile on Education, he says something about the phenomenon feeling, which I guess is very central to the way we experience ourselves in contemporary culture. He says, conscience, conscience, divine instinct, immortal voice from heaven, sure guide for the ignorant and vined indeed, yet intelligent and free, judge of good and evil, making man like God. An interesting thing about this quote is that what Rousseau did is that he replaced the old scheme of God, nature, man, for God, nature, and man. And he saw in nature also an expression of the inner nature of people, and that the inner nature, our feelings, our intuition, is something to get in touch with. And if we get in touch with this inner nature, this intuitive feelings, we might know the way to live our lives, that we know that this is an authority inside of us, not something outside of us. Rousseau and many other romantics who followed him replaced God, as it were, with the human nature itself as the most goddess thing in life. And it was not the outside world or a rational capacity, reason, so to say, but the voice of nature, the inner feeling, the instinct that would lead human beings in the right direction. It was a moral force, so to say. Our feelings are a moral force, and the more we get in contact with our feelings, the more we know what to do in life. And for Rousseau, life was a kind of restoration of our primitive state of being when we were still much more in contact with nature. And there was eventually the goal to find this kind of a spiritual autonomy. And who was else that to be, or who could be the best in doing that? That was from the Romantic period, the artist. There's this famous quote from a philosopher, Charles Taylor, which wrote a book in the end of the 80s called The Sources of the Self, Making the Modern Identity, in which I guess the relationship between the discussion on the self and the selfie and narcissism and self-aestheticization, self-presentation is very clearly linked to the idea of the artist, which came up from the Romantic area. And he says, we think of people who achieved originality in their lives as creative, and that we describe the lives of non-artists in artistic terms matches our tendency to consider artists as somehow paradigm achievers of self-definition. So in that sense, you could say that the artist is in more or less an embodiment, or the Romantic artist has become an embodiment of many of us in the way that we'd like to achieve a living or a life which is authentic, in which we are able to express our authentic core, our authentic identity in a very creative way. We live in a creative industry, a creative economy. Creativity has become a very central concept in modern societies, Western societies. But of course, the question is, what is our real nature? If we go a step further and we see another version of this picture, we can also see that this world is becoming more technologized or technological by the day. There are maybe none segments in life which are not mediated by technology in any kind of way. So this distinction which the Romantics makes between nature and society, between culture and technology, between the subject and the object, these borders are pretty hard to make in our contemporary culture. And then the question derives is that should we maybe rethink this idea of the self, and in what ways does our technological culture already does this? And I guess the whole conference is kind of centered around this question. The last one, and then I think we have made the evolution to the selfie, is this version of The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, in which the smartphone becomes a part of him and becomes also a part of the landscape around him. We could say that we live in a world where technique or technology and culture are not separate anymore. We might just be easier to say that we live in a technological culture, and that this romantic period might also be coming to an end, because I always have to think about something the philosopher Hegel said, is that if you want to understand a period in history, at the moment you're really going to understand this kind of periods, then you'll be at the end of the period as well. So we might came because we can now clearly see a bit more about this idea about the self and authenticity, although we don't really know in essence maybe what it is, but we are very clear that we are still that very children of the romantic period, that we might be on the edge of something new, which we probably not able to fully comprehend or describe yet. And my question for today, my personal question for today will be, what comes after the selfie? What will be next after the selfie? Maybe there will be some suggestions among the fellow speakers, which will be introduced shortly, and maybe in the audience as well, something I would like you to think about this question. I would like to give to you one suggestion, which I just had to realize today when I made the presentation. I had to think about this holiday I had in France with my girlfriend in 2014, and we were making pictures of the lovely landscape and the area, and we thought about, well, should we post something on Facebook or not? We clearly didn't want to make a selfie, and then we thought about we were in a funny mood. We thought, can we think about something else than the selfie? And then we thought about the around me, and I just wanted to give you one example of the around me, in which I do appear in the picture, but especially I am part of my surroundings, and this might be just a small suggestion of what might come next after the selfie. Now I would like to introduce, or at least to invite the guests of tonight to the stage. And these are Rob Horning from the United States, New York, Erika Scourti from London, and Ismene Wyss from Swiss. Yes, a bit of applause would be nice. We start today with a presentation of Erika. I'm sorry, Ismene, sorry, made a mistake. And I would like to invite Ismene for her presentation. Ismene was born in 1989, studied art history with a focus on contemporary art at the University of Bern. She completed her master's degree with a thesis entitled The Blogging Artist, IYY, Constructing of Identity Through a New Medium. Currently, she is employed as a scientific assistant at the University of Bern, and she started her PhD on the topic social media as a material in contemporary art in November. And the floor is yours, Ismene.
Presentation. Super. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Broadcast yourself. The famous YouTube slogan promises the digital natives an omnipresence in the scope of the internet, and thus also the wished-for fame that can result from it. One might say that through this medium, Andy Warhol's 15 minutes of fame are now within everyone's potential reach. Today, everybody has the chance to connect with a global audience and to communicate with it through social media like YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Linked to it is the necessity to express oneself in front of an online community while at the same time distinguishing yourself from it. Indeed, the development of social media is connected directly with the participation of the users and their interaction in a so-called digital society. The digital natives, the generation that is born in the 1980s and 1990s, and that has grown up with a prevalent presence of digital media in everyday life, are in the center of this phenomenon. In recent years, the use of social media, along with the creation of digital personalities, has played a significant role in our contemporary society and global culture. A society without social media is nowadays hardly imaginable, because it feeds the public's interest with the life and thoughts of other people. It consequently comes as no surprise that young artists use social media as an artistic medium, rendering this social phenomenon a highly relevant topic for current art historical research. Social media can therefore be called a new genre of art, a space of new potential to reflect identity, authenticity, and self-representation in the post-digital age. The phenomenon of the social media becomes especially apparent in the everyday media use. Take, for example, Kim Kardashian. With her 76 million of followers or friends, she is known as the star of Instagram. She documents her life publicly and therefore shares apparently authentic, intimate insights with her fans. Thereby, social media transforms isolated actions to a connected narrative. This leads to the production of an identity which becomes at the same time a recognizable brand. By this excessive and perfected use of social media, Kim Kardashian has become an icon of the selfie hype and an icon for millions of followers. As a result of her online presence through the selfie in 2015, Kim Kardashian published her first book entitled Selfish. It is a collection of photographs and reveals several unpublished selfies of Kim Kardashian. On 450 pages, the book features selfies including photos of family and friends, travel pictures, and of course, nude photographs, all taken from different perspectives. Kim Kardashian shows us that we live in the age of the selfie. But what is a selfie and which artistic potential does it have in the contemporary discussion about identity and authenticity in social media? Are selfies a reflection of the narcissistic tendency of our contemporary society? Or can the quality of selfies be situated in the development of a digital society? Let us take, for example, Willem Popelier's The Do-It-Yourselfie Guide. This work is a collection of 149 selfies of the artist. The guide contains 66 selfies accompanied by 66 rules for taking a selfie. Popelier says, I quote, "Go and take your own selfie based on rules applied by the stars. You can shine just like them. All you need is a camera, yourself, and a hashtag." End of quote. The artist uses the phenomenon of the selfie to show as a mirror of the actual development of self-representation and identity in social media. Having an art historical perspective in mind, the discussion around the self is not a new phenomenon. But through social media, Willem Popelier reveals a new set of questions that can be raised in this context and on which I concentrate in my research. What is the digital me? How did the self-perception change in the post-digital age? Is identity connected to interaction? Is my virtual self real? Which role do selfies have in art historical context? My favorite definition of selfie comes from urbandictionary.com. It says, I quote, "A photo taken of yourself to be posted to social media, which is not all that different from masturbating if it makes you feel satisfied with yourself." End of quote. With 200 million hashtags on Instagram, selfies are the most popular genre of photography circulating in social media. Against this background, it becomes clear why artists have now discovered selfie as a new form of artistic expression. It does argue that the selfie is one of the best examples to talk about self-representation and digital communities in contemporary art. We can take Amalia Ullmann as a great showcase for this phenomenon. Ullmann is intentionally misleading her followers on Instagram. For her performance excellencies and perfections, she used Instagram to craft a narrative about Amalia Ullmann that documented her relationship breakup, plastic surgery, and recovery. For privilege, she has been charting the pregnancy of Amalia Ullmann, posting selfies with a bulging belly. In her work, Amalia Ullmann establishes a distinctly female view and produces images that appear as complex depictions of her life. In her performance, she demonstrates that social media is a place striving for authenticity. The current digital image culture revolves around sharing and signaling, which calls for a new politics and ethics of looking and being looked at. What is real? What is fake? This project shows the discrepancy between fiction and reality in social media. What interests me most about this discussion is that Amalia Ullmann's works bring us through social media to new questions of gender, intimacy, and surveillance. A completely different approach can be stated in the work of Ai Weiwei. He is the perfect example to show how powerful and convincing an artist can be in influencing his self-representation through social media and the outreach it can generate. I quote, "If to express oneself one needs a reason, let me say that to express oneself is the reason." End of quote. This was the first sentence which Ai Weiwei posted on November 2005 on his blog. Weiwei wrote during 6 years government-critical artistic and aesthetics statements on his own blog. The government did obviously not accept Ai Weiwei's position to express his opinion freely. On May 2009, the blog was extinguished. After the blockage, Weiwei found another way to communicate with the world. He learned how to handle social media. With more than 316,000 followers on Twitter, 70,000 followers on Facebook, and 254,000 subscribers on Instagram, the general public has accepted this new media of communication extremely well. The need to express himself and to be understood can be observed as particularly distinctive in the persona of Ai Weiwei. His opinion is omnipresent. Almost on every social media platform, lots of statements of the artist can be found. In my opinion, Ai Weiwei is aware of the wide reach of social media and uses this consciously to convey his opinion and to shape his artistic persona. I argue that this framing even has the force of forming a discourse. Through the use of social media and selfies, the related disclosure of his privacy and the perfect handling of the expectation of his audience, he is able to construct his own cult image. Ai Weiwei is using social media to strategically manage the perception of his work, transforming it from a series of isolated projects to a streaming feed that transforms the artist's identity into a recognizable brand. But how authentic can this brand be? In conclusion, we photograph, we save, we store, we share, we like, and we view in new ways. Social media have become one of the powerful, or maybe the most powerful tool of society to create a digital self. As an art historian, I'm interested in this cultural phenomenon that has started to be taken over by artists because it establishes various interesting and very researchable moments. First, what I try to show with the example of YouTube, it changes our question about the self in a post-digital age. Through the Web 2.0, now everyone is exposed to the world. This brings to the fore new questions of voyeurism, self-determination, and exhibitionism. Additionally, social media are present as different potentials and problems regarding the discrepancy between reality and fiction, social life in digital communities, gender, and the artist as a brand. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismene. I was wondering, one of the guests on the stage, what is the first reaction for you? What comes up first when hearing this story of Ismene?
I guess I've been thinking about selfies not in terms of an art historical context, but more in terms of sort of communicative sort of mode, where like most selfies aren't taken with the idea that they're going to be some sort of aesthetic object necessarily, but more and more with messaging apps, they're more about communicating in the instant and sending your face to someone else, not as a sign that you want that face to be admired for all time, but as a sign to sort of indicate that you're alive and you are there and you are trying to connect to them. So I think it's a different. So when I think about selfies being masturbatory, I think that's a particular kind of selfie. I don't get that sense of selfies being. That's the way that they're normally being exchanged, as a not as a way to sort of cut yourself off, but as a way to sort of reach out to people.
Okay. So what you basically say is that for most of us, taking a selfie is just a form of quick communication, of just making sure you're still there and showing you've been somewhere, instead of a self-aesthetization, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously both at the same time, but I've been sort of thinking about it more along the lines of how are they sort of becoming more ubiquitous and sort of less pressurized, as opposed to being entirely pressurized. It feels like that's sort of how selfies have evolved from sort of like a Facebook mentality or an Instagram mentality of I need to put a perfect picture on there because everyone's going to see it for all time, to a more ephemeral mode where you put a picture out there to a specific group of people and then it goes away.
Yeah, I just have to remember I was in New York this summer, and I went to the memoriam, 9/11 memoriam. And what you could see there as well is that people making selfies of themselves in front of the memoriam, which is a kind of more or less sacred place. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, it just seems like perfectly natural because, like, the point is not to if you want a picture of the memorial, you can just go online and download a picture of the memorial. Or if you wanted to send somebody else a picture of the memorial, it would make no sense to send one without you in it. Because the fact that you're there is the thing you're trying to sort of memorialize and capture. So if you just take the picture at all, it may as well have you in it. It seems totally natural to be sort of like facing backwards the thing that you're seeing rather than looking at it, if the point is to sort of project your inclusion in that place.
Erika, do you have any short comments on Ismene's story?
I guess, two, and I'll try and be really quick. But the first thing is that I also thought that the kind of masturbatory comment, it sounded like it had been written by a teenage boy, in the sense that when narcissism is brought up in the context of selfies, it can quite often be a kind of shorthand denigration of women's self-representation, particularly young women's self-representation online, and that sense of it's a way of basically saying, oh, they're so narcissistic, despite the fact that arguably that's exactly what's required of them by capitalism in order to be readable as women at all. And just the second thing I was thinking was with Ai Weiwei, he's, in a sense, he's kind of nothing new, because people like Byron and Courbet were also brilliant crafters of their public image way before anything digital. And ironically, of course, Byron is seen as this great romantic artist, but clearly he was very aware of his media narrative and was very successful at propagating it.
We're talking about Lord Byron, eh? To
Lord
make
Byron,
sure, yeah. Okay, Ismene, one last comment from your side. Yeah, we could just wait for that for the next, after the presentation. Then I will just give the stage to Erica. And Erica was born in Athens, in Greece, and is now based in London. And she works with different media, draws on personal experience to explore life, labor, gender, and love in a fully mediated world. And today she will be talking about the critique on selfie feminism and the claim on agency, if I'm correct. But floor is yours. Take your time.
Wow. That was a good moment to swallow the water wrong. But thanks for the introduction. Yeah, a lot of my work is in a kind of mode of performative autobiography, in the sense that it draws on personal experience to explore contemporary subjectivity entangled within institutions, social, political, and technological. And so much of my work relates to authenticity and to the appearance of the self across the different platforms that monetize our sociality. But I have to say, on seeing the title of the panel, which was From Self to Selfie, I felt compelled to talk directly about selfies, despite the fact that it doesn't appear in the kind of anything, nothing to do with gender or selfies appears in the blurb, which I found quite strange, because to me it's impossible to talk about selfies without foregrounding specifically female self-representation and the use of selfies as an artistic strategy of what Joanna Fateman has called critical mirroring, but could also be called a kind of subversive mimicry. And this is a little bit what I wanted to talk about, because at the same time I don't really want to talk about selfies. First of all, because I don't actually use them that much in my work, and I would argue that as a critical strategy they are on the wane. And that is partly because, like many other white, able-bodied, cisgendered female artists, I've come to question the impact and agency of what came to be called selfie feminism. So Sarah Burke, in an article which is about Petra Kortrai's work, and if you can see that the title of the article is actually quite telling in itself, Crying on Camera, Fourth Wave Feminism and the Threat of Commodification. She kind of explains selfie feminism as the idea that selfies are empowering because they reclaim the male gaze by allowing women to flip their own gaze onto themselves and let it be publicly known that they're doing so. And thereby, in that act, there is a kind of emancipatory potential in that gesture. And in a further flip, it's not just the gaze that's reclaimed, but also by piggybacking, using the platforms to share these images. There's a sense in which artists could be piggybacking the access to an audience that these social media platforms supply, and thereby recoup some kind of value from them in the form of increased visibility and attention, which are the ultimate things, obviously, in a social media environment. So, for example, a project of mine, Woman Nature Alone, this is quite an old one, an old project from 2010. So it explicitly engages with both the representation of women in stock imagery and, by extension, the ad industry as a whole. And also, talking of authenticity, I was explicitly interested in the role of nature as this kind of dream site of unfettered self-actualization and authenticity, which is used to sell everything from tampons to yogurt to real estate. So in this project, I reenacted the titles and captions of stock imagery relating to the keywords woman, nature alone, and released them as multiple videos on YouTube, as you can probably see from the screen grab. So part of it was questioning that idea of how women are represented and nature itself in ad imagery, but it was also to do with this question of circulation as a form of currency in itself. So featuring me and then allowing these videos to go online, part of what I was interested in was kind of replay or using the YouTube's algorithms and tagging systems in order to get my images to kind of circulate to get to the top. So by using titles and tagging, like in this image, young, attractive, wet, blonde, etc. And it's always girls, not women, and so on. So this idea here of circulation in itself being a form of agency and having some kind of emancipatory potential perhaps kind of reaches its limit point when you look at the woman enjoying shower clip, which to this date is still my most ever viewed video of all time. So this was a few months ago I took it, so it's probably more than this. And why is that? It's just because of the title, right? I mean, I also got some very handy, like, you know, you really should have taken your dress off, and like, it's not very good framing and things like that. But so, you know, the question then is that what is the value encapsulated in the fact that this image has been watched almost 200,000 times? Because as writer and editor Aisha Siddiqui argues, circulation in itself is not empowering. So this was the kind of question is there an emancipatory valence to this form of self-representation? And what's more, what type of femininity does it reinforce? If it is a strategy of kind of critical mirroring, that assumes an understanding and a kind of complete, just collective go-to of what the stereotype is, especially when these types of self-representation can and have been absorbed into a mainstream of media, magazine circulation. For example, Playboy covers. So this one this is taken from the article by Sarah Burke, and it's using specifically a social media Snapchat aesthetic. So this is one of the things that I've been kind of wondering about, although of course for female artists, these tensions around what happens when you present yourself as young and beautiful, etc., when that's exactly what the media and capitalism has always kind of thrived on and profited from those images. And some of these debates were surrounded Hannah Wilke as well. So in a kind of, in a way to kind of, you know, one of the things that has really made me question this mode of working as a female artist is Aria Dean's writing on selfie feminism, and particularly whether it holds anything of value for black women at all. She says, making one's subjectivity visible or affirming one's existence through a selfie has yet to demolish the gaze. In 2016, catapulting ourselves into circulation as image fragments no longer makes for resistance or revolution. And she goes on to point out that one of the major pitfalls of what came to be called selfie feminism was its adherence, however unintentional perhaps, to a universal female experience located in the female body, meaning really, in actuality, a white, cisgendered, able-bodied, young, thin and preferably attractive female body and face, i.e. the body that has always been an engine of commerce. So she argues that that to approach the ruins of the selfie politic with a critical edge is maybe something that only black women, femmes and gender non-conforming people can bring to it. And she brings up the example of Shawnee McAlane Holloway, who works in this mode of selfie feminism, but again, because she is not necessarily deconstructing the stereotype, which I was saying before is generally a white, etc., stereotype. There is a different valence to it. So I would argue that this uneasiness with the over-circulation of specifically white and kind of hot babe feminism images is partly what has led to the demise or wane of the selfie in my own work and possibly more widely. And I just thought of this the other day, and I haven't really worked this through, but I've been thinking about forms of agency or rather I've been thinking that there may be a shift towards other forms of feminine and non-binary kind of power and agency, such as an increasing interest in witchcraft, for example, in the work of people like Beatrice Loft-Schultz, and also maybe looking at self-care and of a kind of radical self-care in practices that rely less on subversive mimicry of self-representation and more on affirmingly positively, perhaps, against racist, patriarchal, heteronormative regimes of power. And an example there could be Tabitha Rosaire, who's actually in the audience. So I have ended up talking about selfies after all, despite my kind of uncertainty around it. And I suppose I haven't really spoke about authenticity, except that taking from Rousseau's inner sense model of authenticity, surely part of that was the idea of a kind of autonomy and an autonomous being who could self-define and kind of wasn't swayed by others. Also surely implies one who can take actions and can shape the world around them. Of course, Rob has critiqued this idea that this has been taken up by marketers as under the guise of autonomous consumerism. The idea that by consuming authentically, you can kind of express the person you're really meant to be. You can be yourself through the selection of the right trainers, hair, or soya milk, or whatever it is. So in that sense, authenticity does relate to agency through the idea of kind of having some sense of autonomy over one's world. And so this has been running the whole time, so I have no idea how much time I've got left. But I'm hoping I'd have a little bit of time to show a bit of a video called Negative Docs, because this is another thing that in my work I've been interested in, answering maybe Ruben's question of what comes after the selfie. I mean, it's already here, obviously, is the profile. And the thing about profiles is that, of course, some of them we craft ourselves, like dating profiles and Facebook and whatever, but there are also so many others which we don't, and which we have no power over either creating or seeing who gets to see them, or why, or what they do with them. So everything from kind of healthcare and insurance and your credit rating and and all of these things which really do have agency in terms of that it might stop you getting care or getting a house. So with this video, Negative Dots, it's a reading of all of my most negative documents through a speed reading app, which is a kind of efficiency app to get you to read faster because we're all running out of time, etc., etc. So what I did was I used a sentiment analysis software of all of my writing to try and determine the most negative documents, and then ordered them in order of increasing negativity. So I'll show a little bit of it. This is only like a couple of minutes long, I think, and then maybe talk a little bit about it. I should say it's a kind of portrait of depression and burnout through a kind of algorithmic reading of it, which claims in some way, because there's a sentiment analysis, some software has been put in between, there's a kind of claim to truth in it, in the sense that an algorithm or a bot, it can't really be insincere. It's not trying to impress anyone. So there could be a claim that it's kind of creating an empirically objective portrait of oneself. So,
in conditions of insufficient light, perception is achromatic and ultimately black.
Do I tire you? I do, don't I? Shit, hopeless, harassed, awful, worthless, hell, twerps, miserable, loser, too stupid. Well, I was despondent yesterday, going around in sharp-angled circles again. Demon, shadow forces, maneuverable place, active effort, dogs crap, the frazzled edges are there, but constantly overridden, like out of sight, like the dream. And bird falling, a stream of loss of some sort. I'm definitely in the valleys. Fun night, noise sensitivity really big, taking significant, because sad, big difference, because like what, the way you have helped me. Social element, expecting today, busting, feeling balance, so reading myself, people's attention, weird sex, mucks, anticipation, last fuck, is this the worst? Similar places, stressful morning, downish evening, unknown reason, wide circle, main attribute, chemistry needed something. Horrible rises, I have felt very out of it, disconnected, like what do I really care about? There are so many things that it gets overwhelming. Oh, that's possibly the end already. So that was very quick. So, so as I was saying, it's this idea of a kind of empirical, objective view of the algorithm, which of course we all know, there's no such thing as a neutral tool, and certainly not of an algorithm. But another thing that I was interested in here was kind of playing into another way that authenticity maybe comes into self-representation online, and that's to do with the kind of sad mode. Which is exemplified by.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
are we out of time?
Yeah. Could you
so
wrap up?
I'll leave it there then. This is just to say that against the kind of like slick, lean in, like wellness feminism, it's a kind of assertion of the messy and the ugly and the sad as some kind of, again, as a site of a kind of emancipatory potential. Thank you.
All right. Time is always faster than you want it to be. I would like to give the stage immediately to Rob, and then afterwards we hope we have some time left for a few questions also from the audience. Rob.
Thanks.
I will shortly introduce you, of course, Rob. Rob is a contributor, editor of The New Inquiry, and his famous article in 2009 called The Death of the Hipster in Pop Matters, he states that the hipster might be the embodiment of postmodernism as a spent force, revealing what happens when pastiche and irony exhaust themselves as aesthetics. Rob, the floor is yours.
Famous. Thanks. Well, this is, I called this Selfies Without the Self, but I'm not sure that title makes sense anymore. Anyway, the selfies are ubiquitous now. There's still a nagging sense that they're somehow intrinsically narcissistic. This worry is not new to technology. Before there were even selfies in the 1990s, historian Hillel Schwartz lamented in his book The Culture of the Copy that our self-portraits seem to neither anchor nor to extend. Perhaps, he continues, because our false intimacies lash us onto a narcissism ever enamored of but ever discontented with likeness. Perhaps because amidst the parade of electronic spectacles, all we can make of ourselves is suspect. Perhaps because the best we can manage in a world of simulacra is a visage unavoidably generic. That seems very pessimistic. But what makes an intimacy false is simply because it's mediated in electronic spectacle. Are selves suspect simply because they can be mediated, now more so than ever? And why should we assume that a generic visage is something regrettable rather than a positive achievement? When we become generic, we become legible, readable. It indicates that we have articulated the conventions by which we want to be understood, or they've been articulated for us. Now that we punctuate our conversations with images of ourselves, the importance of legibility rather than some aesthetic obfuscation of the self is perhaps easier to recognize. Sometimes the discourse around selfies, though, seems stuck where Schwartz was in the early 90s, as though there's only self-idealizing portraiture. And that selfie-taking or self-portraiture is a procedure of solipsistic self-regard in which one obsesses over one's own image. But selfies especially are not solipsistic. They're only selfies if they can be imagined to circulate. The term selfie not only labels an image's content, though even that usage is slipping. My bank tells me I should send check selfies to make my deposits. But it also describes a distribution of an archiving process. Selfie is shorthand not just for the pictures you take of yourself, but instead for one's self in social media, one's self commoditized to suit the logistics of networks. Art critic a few years ago, Brian Drucker, wrote this about selfies. Producing a reflection of your image in Instagram always involves an awareness of the presence of others, the knowledge that your selfie is flaking and refracting in their phones. Labeling this reflection selfie tacitly recognizes the horizontal proliferation of reflections, the dissolution of personhood in the network. The real narcissists, he says, are the ones who never take selfies. They imagine their self as autonomous, hermetic, too precious to be shared. In other words, participating in selfie culture betokens a strong sense of self rather than the fragile, brittle self of the traditional narcissist. The selfie from this perspective is contingent not on the self but the audience, and more specifically, the point of contact between them. It's not an inward gesture of self-absorption, but an outward gesture of recognition. I want to show you that I'm here, thinking of you. If Drucker is right, selfies, when they enter circulation, aren't a matter of self-expression, as their defenders sometimes claim, but self-surrender. That idea makes the most sense in ephemeral media, in texts and messaging apps and so forth. In archival media like Instagram and Facebook, selfies may appear not as communication, but as strategic performance, sort of what Amalia Ullman was getting at in her performances, or in that 2014 thing. Posting selfies is often seen as a part of an effort to build social capital, an effort to deploy the self in a social network to gain attention, reputation, influence, and so on. And it instrumentalizes self-representation. Selfies are a way to explicitly conflate ourselves with objects to be manipulated, to be appraised. This instrumental attitude blocks reciprocity and imposes a critical distance between the self in the selfie and its audience, from whom only judgment is demanded. This makes selfie open to the criticism that they are inauthentic, that the selves posted in there, or the selves that are posing in them, are trying too hard to be something. Another way of framing that, however, is to say that the strategic quality of selfies brings authenticity into play. Authenticity discourse always implies a judgment of the effectiveness of a self-performance, even when what's being performed is non-performance. It's not that selfies are inauthentic, it's that they make authenticity a question. In effect, a selfie is authentic when it works as a container of the self's reputational value, its cultural capital. A selfie is inauthentic when it doesn't work anymore. The idea that there isn't a performance going on, however, is not credible. Selfies don't fail because they are performative, in short. Now, selfies may be mistaken for autonomous self-expression, an assertive, short-circuiting gesture that somehow recuperates the archival communication surveillance platforms that otherwise contain the self. But selfies don't tap a suppressed inner essence. They develop the self as an artisanal product line. What they express depends less on what they depict than on how well they are assessed and to what uses they are put within these networks. The meaning is in the metrics. These sorts of selfie commemorate the moment when external social control, sort of the neoliberalist injunction to develop a self as a kind of capital stock and serially reproduce oneself in self-advertisements, is internalized as crypto-defiance. I'm not going to consume their images. I'm going to make my own images and control how I'm seen. With selfies, we can think we are asserting an agency that escapes control, though this is actually control's exact contemporary mechanism. Producing ourselves as an object for the network, performing the obligatory work of identity construction in a captured, pre-formatted space. Selfies, then, primarily signal the availability of the self to these economic circuits of value. The practice of selfie making doesn't eradicate or dissolve the infrastructure of commercially exploitable identity that is embedded in the media tools for expressing it. The selfie doesn't invent a language of identity. It marks a voluntary entry into established codes, reinforcing their validity, even if a particular selfie tries to subvert them. Alexander Galloway claims that the economic mobilization of self-production that selfies epitomize have prompted a new politics of disappearance. And this is a quote. The operative political question today, thus, in the shadow of digital markets, is the exodus question. First posed as, what are we going to do without them? And later posed in a more sophisticated sense as, what are we going to do without ourselves? If we can only have a self on Facebook, and Facebook is patently exploitative, then maybe we need to learn how to not have selves, is basically what he seems to be saying. But maybe exodus is not the impetus for such selflessness. In its explicit constructedness, the selfie may herald the emergence of a kind of post-authentic self, a dynamic, overtly manufactured self that is confirmed and rendered coherent in an audience's reactions and is always changing with each image as opposed to being some sort of static, real self. Selfies assault the notion of autonomous, persistent, transcendent identity. Intentionally or not, the willingness to take them and share them demonstrates a loss of interest in uncovering some authentic self in the inside, the sort of Rousseauian self. Instead, they express a desire to be remade anew at any given moment, sort of a fluid identity idea. We can't then pit the self against the selfie as if the selfie is some degraded version of the legitimate self. If anything, the selfie structures the self as something being held back. the self becomes nothing more than a selfie that we haven't shared yet. We've produced the self because there are selfies with which to represent it. So selfie taking recognizes that the notion of the self always implies another's point of view on it, a perspective that generates it. The act of taking a selfie simulates and evokes that outside point of view. It makes our self real to us, something that we can experience and consume at the expense of pretending to be someone else as we look at it. In the process, the onlooker we simulate, that transcendent, dematerialized perspective that, thanks to ubiquitous connectivity, can come from anywhere or from nowhere, is authenticated. The observer within us is the authenticated thing, not the object we are in the picture that we're presenting. We can only imagine being a subject by manifestly presenting ourselves as object. The selfie breaks us out of the cage of static identity, but the archival platforms they are posted to tend to shove us back in. They attempt to integrate all the data that we generate into a personal profile. The platforms affirm that I am a discrete self, one baseball card in their pack, with my statistics always printed on the back. Thanks.
All right. Okay. We have now heard a few very interesting perspectives on this matter of the selfie. I just had, when I heard your story, Rob, I came to this thought: do we live in a selfie society? Could you say it like, because you tend to go to the direction that the selfie is so part of our structure, our capitalist structure, that it is actually an act of participating in the system. That if you don't make a selfie, you don't participate in the system. Is that could I interpret it like that?
I think that's a fair interpretation. I think it's sort of banal to be using selfies, taking selfies, sending selfies around, and maybe, I mean, it would be, there's some argument you can make for like the society of the selfie and along the lines of the society of the spectacle. You can do some sort of like, I don't know, some sort of, you know, apply that same analysis, but just replace spectacle with selfie, and you probably get something similar.
Yeah, and how does this intriguing quote you gave from the real narcissist is someone who doesn't make any selfies? How does this resonate with that idea of being part of the system as producing self-images?
Yeah, I just don't think. Yeah, I mean, I don't think being part of the system makes you narcissistic. I think being part of the system makes you not narcissistic. You know, because you're part of the system. I mean, you're making yourself available to the system. You're not like closed in a hermetic loop of self, where you're not so sort of like fragile in your sense of self that it can't withstand being sort of injected into systems. But then like sort of maybe take that one step further and say that like the system is injecting the self into you, which kind of scuttles that a little bit. But
all right. Well, Erica, you talk about selfie feminism as also a way, or that is being portrayed as a way of rebellion. That then I guess this idea of the system or society or the structures of society also come along in your story do I understand you correct if you say that this selfie feminism is in many ways not an act of rebellion or an act of resistance?
I think, what comes to mind is Judith Butler saying that it's not going to be up to her to decide which acts of mimicry are subversive or not. And, it can be the same thing. I don't want to say that any time a woman appears as herself or works with her own image, that it's a kind of failed or, it's immediately capitulating to capitalism and to the male gaze, because, of course, there are always new and interesting ways of doing that. But I do think at the moment that a certain impasse maybe has been reached, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at. But with my image of Hannah Wilke, that's kind of trying to show this is a historical argument that comes up very often in feminist artwork, particularly when it features the artist herself.
Yeah, and so you already tried to give an answer on my question, like what is going to be next, or what is after the selfie. And I guess you're right that there already are movements which are here at the moment, which might direct to this idea of the profile you were mentioning as something which is a product of algorithms, more or less, or where algorithms come into play and become more dominant in profiling us in many ways as consumers, as a medical patient or whatever. Do I understand you correct that there is a room or a space for artists to play with that profile, to make it more messy? Is that a form of,
Yeah, I think so,
form of
definitely.
resistance or
Yeah,
subversive form
yeah.
of?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think there can be ways of playing with a kind of algorithmic gaze or of kind of fashioning a profile in order to either destroy your online profile or kind of do something with it. It basically work against the way that it's supposed to work. One of those things could be by becoming unreadable, and maybe that links into what Rob was talking about in terms of the kind of disappearance.
The self, that
Yeah,
not
kind of-
being a self anymore.
Or a kind of exodus. One kind of exodus could be through by creating unreadable profiles, or maybe through proxies. That's another thing I was thinking while you were talking about. Maybe it could be like the next thing could be proxies, which stand in for the self, but maybe they allow, or for the selfie, which so there could be something in that, in the proxy, allowing some kind of presence everywhere, but also a disappearance at the same time.
Yeah, if you look at the opening film, where the diary is being taken as something like a central phenomenon, and then that this diary has been opening up, that we all have become, the diary has become something like the digital world where we open up our diary and show it to everyone. Could you say that is also a way of closing or going back to a certain diary, that you keep things for yourself and try to show a very messy profile or a messy identity on the digital world? Is it?
Perhaps. I mean, I think I don't know if you're relating to the last bit that I showed with the kind of the kind of sadness and that's I don't know if that necessarily is the same thing. I mean, it could be that one way of confusing a profile could simply be by posting a lot and in lots of different ways. I mean, this is something that I did with a project a few years ago where I just liked lots and lots of different things online in order to blur the kind of image that was created of me, and kind of not just liking things but sharing and commenting and really kind of committing myself to becoming an every woman who is therefore, if you like everything, you are nobody really in terms of a profile, and you have no value.
Ismene?
Yeah, thinking about that and about your question, what is coming next, I have to think about a series in the television named Black Mirror. And there is like this episode where a guy died, and this guy or the girl, where the girlfriend after his death could like phone with him, because a computer was able to save all the things he have ever posted on social media or have ever put in the internet, and then he became a digital self. And it was like an algorithms talking with her as a new boyfriend, but he was dead. So maybe that will be next, or after the selfie, the digital or the artificial self.
Yeah, yeah. You already also mentioned this idea of that when we talk about artificiality or mediated stuff, that we tend to look at it as something inauthentic. Eh? Like, is this a discussion we can go beyond? Do we have to get rid of that word authenticity? Does it help us to understand contemporary technological culture? And
yeah, I mean, it seems like it's hard to get rid of. It just sort of mutates along with sort of where, it's always sort of describing the aspirational goals of personhood at any given sort of moment. So it's not like we can get rid of authenticity because it's serving that function. Sort of positing, positing, personhood as this thing that's aspirational as opposed to given. So and that sort of suits all sorts of sort of economic ends. So that I feel like that idea we're stuck with that. But I feel like what authenticity consists of is changing. It's less this idea that we need to somehow be unmediated and aspire to find some way of expressing our spontaneity through doing things, but it is moving toward instead this sort of serial production online, where what makes us authentic is the fact that we're constantly generating new content, and so the mediate itself will be like seen as the authentic self, and like what eludes mediation will just not be even inauthentic, but just sort of be irrelevant in a certain sense. And then that sort of content can be fed into our sort of post-mortal bot that will continue to be us when we're gone. And then we'll be superfluous altogether.
Digital echoes of ourselves, which go into virtual space and make their own life. Okay, I guess we're almost there. We still have 10 minutes, so I was really wondering if there are any questions or comments from the audience still so far. Yes, up there.
Hi. So I've been kind of interested in like anonymity as authenticity recently, authenticity per se, and I was wondering, I guess specifically about like some examples that were mentioned, like Ai Weiwei and Amalia Ullman. I'm curious how we can cope with like putting their image as their message when oftentimes, like when Ai Weiwei posed as like a dead refugee on a beach, whether or not he was appropriating a struggle of someone and kind of putting his name onto something that was someone else's experience. And if Amalia Ullman was to kind of pretend to be a victim of abuse from her boyfriend or whatever, whether or not that can be like an authentic telling of a story because they weren't the people who experienced those things.
Is this question directed to some of the guests here, or is it a general?
General, I guess.
Okay.
You can start.
Ismene, have you anything?
It's a really difficult question. It's like about, I think, about authenticity and how they can post it, because also if they are not experiencing these moments, it's like, they can, or Amalia Ullman, maybe Ai Weiwei, it's like another discussion, but Amalia Ullman emphasizes this point that she's like talking about something or showing something that is completely staged. So she is like, with her work, she really takes us to this point to think about what's real and what's not real, what's fake, and how are we staging in social media our lives, or how somebody is staging. And they, you know, there are a lot of these Instagram girls or that had in this public, and they post these perfect pictures of themselves, and after them they post some really big texts where they say, okay, that was not me, that was for a company, and I just had to look really great to make some money on this social media platform. So this theme of authentic, it's in Amalia Ullman's work really here. Another question is it with Ai Weiwei, because Ai Weiwei is really, there is the moment of the brand. So what is the brand? That's the same question behind Kim Kardashian, who is taking all these pictures for her. Not only Selfie, you can see, okay, she's taking the picture, but how many pictures is she taking, and which one is going to social media and posting and reflecting on the other people? Or the second part, I don't have already an answer, but maybe the others.
Erica?
I think maybe your question touched on something which I think is really interesting, particularly in an age where kind of there are images and stories relating to everything available at our fingertips, and that's maybe the ethics of appropriation, and to what extent is it okay to step into somebody else's experience when it's certainly not your own in any way. Personally, it's something that I would find difficult, and that image of Ai Weiwei, I just thought, I thought that was just beyond the pale for exactly the reasons you said. I think, maybe because there's also been, maybe because of the way that artists are accessible online, we know something of their biography and their identity, and so maybe it becomes something that we're also trying to kind of work out, like, is this something they've experienced? You know, can they speak for me? Do they have any legitimacy? Or are they just using this because it's good fodder for their own artwork? And, you know, I don't necessarily have an answer for it, but I do think it's an interesting question around the ethics of that.
I think Ai Weiwei is a really good example for this discrepancy between can he do that, or is that just too much for, yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions in the audience? No? All right. Well, then I would like to just briefly go back to that, what you were saying, Ismene, about how the question of what is real and what is fake. That these are questions which tend to stick with us all the time. And we, if we look at these ways, the digital world is changing our ideas about the self and the self-presentation. In what way does it fundamentally changes our perceptions of the self? If one of the other guests has ideas about that, please just say something. But Erica, you would like to say something first, or?
I feel like I'm talking too much, which is always what happens.
I'll say when you have to. We
Okay,
still have a few minutes, so I want to hear from all of you. Just
well, I think this thing of like the you know, the fakeness, that is it real or is it not? I think there's always a moment which is interesting in artworks, which is this question of, you know, is this art basically? Is this the performance, or has it ended? And for me, Amalia Ullmann's performance or piece was at its most interesting actually at the point when you didn't know that it was all staged or, you know, all a performance. It was exactly that kind of slippage between what seemed to be her lived experience and something staged, which made it quite compelling because it was hard to say kind of where the performance ended. There was something else I wanted to say.
And if you compare this with Ai Weiwei, this ambiguity that she shows in her movie, is that similar to Ai Weiwei, or is it different?
No, I mean, you know, in the example of the restaging of The Refugee, I mean, of course not. So there's no ambiguity there. There's just like, why would you do that? Apart from self-promotion. That's the ambiguity, yeah.
So it unmeans ambiguity, maybe, in a way, or maybe it is. Ismene, you have any comments to this?
We have been talking a little bit before the talk, and you sent me this super term, artificial authenticity. And I think that's a really nice term, like discussing about this splitting from the real and not real, or fake and real or digital, and then you're thinking, yeah, how is the story continuing today? We are now talking about what's real and what's digital, but maybe in the post-digital age, we are trying to use this term today. You don't have anymore these like boundaries between real and digital, and then the whole stories will change. I don't know yet, but...
Would there be, Rob, you have the honor to have the last comment. Is there other questions which we might be able to ask instead of, is it real or fake?
Yeah, I mean, that does seem sort of like, yeah, I mean, that built into that question is always an attempt to sort of like create, you know, real humans and non-humans or subhumans or something, and or to sort of, you know, insiders and outsiders, or people who are like have cultural capital and people who don't, or whatever. So I feel like that question is always like an alibi for like talking about these sort of other things, and so it means getting past that question would be good, but it seems unlikely. But you know, in terms of like, you know, the way that the digitality sort of like undermines a sense of like a discrete reality, or like a gets rid of the backstage or does something like that. It does seem like there's a moment of possibility to sort of proliferate selves, or use the digital sort of profiles as sort of like containers that can like, they can field the authenticity questions for us in some way while we're off operating our sort of like covert accounts, and we're operating, you know, sort of in sort of channels that are not public channels, but are sort of sub channels, private channels. In some ways, like there's a lot of talk about the end of privacy, but in some ways, these proliferation of communication just creates different ways in which we're public and different ways in which we're private. And it sort of proliferates privacies in a lot of ways. We can create these sort of different levels of access in some ways.
All right. Well, I would like to, we really are in about 1 minute, yeah, we have to quit. I would like to thank the guests, Rob, Erica, Ismene, and the audience as well. And, well, I hope you have a great evening. Thank you.